you need to get this book. And she's, hopefully, we'll talk a little bit of her brand new book. It's scary, informative, and readable. So, 3 important qualities, I think. She's the Robinson O. Everett Distinguished Professor of Law and Philosophy at Duke Law. She's the founding director of the Duke Science and Society, the faculty chair of the Duke Masters in Bioethics and Science Policy. But I think that the thing that's always most fascinated me about her bio is, okay, she has a BA in Genetics, Cell, and Developmental Biology from Dartmouth College, an ALM in Biology from Harvard University, a JD and an MA from Duke University, as well as a PhD in philosophy. Unbelievable background. And what I love about her, and she gets mad when I say this, but it's true, whenever we're like together, she kind of like pretends like I'm as smart as she is, when we all know it's pretty painfully evident that that's not the case. Nita, without further ado.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It is such a pleasure to have a chance to be here with you today. I think what I might do actually is switch to a lav mic. So let me just grab one of the lav mics. I tend to be a wanderer. And yeah, I'm going to go laptop, lectern. Thank you. Of course, now my computer is trying to update on me while it's been standing over here. So if you have been here in the past, which I know some of you have, Charlie's been kind enough to give me the opportunity to speak in the past about some of the work that I do, which is at the intersection of neuroscience, kind of cutting edge technologies, and what's coming. And in the past, I've often talked about building better soldiers, the kind of coming age of cognitive enhancement and brain-to-brain communication. Today, I'm going to talk about something slightly different. We'll talk a little bit about some of that stuff, but not enhancing soldiers. And I want to talk with you about the 6th domain of warfare, which has arrived, which is cognitive warfare. And I want to focus on that because what you see increasingly across the world is a significant investment in the battle for our brains. And that battle is one that I think many people don't realize has been waged for a while. While some people recognize it as an informational war, it's become much broader than that already. From a recent NATO-funded report, the brain will be the battlefield of the 21st century. Humans are the contested domain, and future conflicts will likely occur amongst the people digitally first and physically thereafter in proximity to hubs of political and economic power. And that idea that there is a different way that wars will be waged and a different focus of how to wage those wars is something that I think is so critically important for us to focus our attention on and focus our readiness and our development of our resources and our national security on in the days ahead. So until recently, NATO had divided the wars into 5 different operational domains, right? Air, land, sea, space. But with its development of cognitive warfare strategies, what they're talking about is the human domain. Okay? The human domain is kind of the critical domain of where wars will be fought. And the main principle of this is that cognitive warfare isn't just to gain an advantage over the enemy by controlling what he thinks, likes, or believes, but also by shaping and reshaping our representations of reality, what we understand to be real and true. And a number of declassified documents over the past decade have shown methods that seem to be the precursors to cognitive warfare, but cognitive warfare has arrived, and as I'll talk about in a moment, shifting that into, together with major shifts in technological developments, from widespread use of brain-computer wearables to generative AI, means that the precision with which that war is going to be fought, and the ability to detect it is going to become increasingly harder. It starts with an information warfare. Then it moves into modes of more direct manipulation of minds. One of the most significant challenges I believe that we're going to face is this coming age of cognitive warfare. We are increasingly reliant on technologies to communicate, to work, to conduct our daily lives. And as a result, our brains are becoming far more vulnerable to cognitive attacks. It is much easier to influence the mind if it is constantly addicted to and engaged with technology, particularly technology that is working in ways that we do not even understand and don't have the ability to stop and question how. And I'll start with talking a little bit about brain heuristics. How do information wars and disinformation campaigns and campaigns to dominate the human brain, what shortcuts are they taking advantage of? So our brains have all kinds of shortcuts that we take. That's how we navigate the world. And for years, I've studied why criminal defendants come into the criminal courtroom and argue, my brain made me do it, and how jurors respond to that, what that looks like, what the kind of response to it is. Now, in some ways, if somebody comes into the criminal courtroom and says, my brain made me do it, we ought to say, yes, it did, right? It should not come as a huge surprise. But somehow, when armed with neuroimages, when they come in with brain scans and show those images into a courtroom, that seems to have an effect on how jurors react to them. That is, they're generally treated more leniently if they come in with brain scans, even if the brain scans don't show that much. Okay, how many of you are experts at reading brain scans? But how many of you are impressed if I put up brain scans and say, this is my brain, right? A number of you, oh, wow, now I understand. I get it now, and you can also sort of compartmentalize it. You can take a reductionist view of me and my actions and look at the brain instead and say, aha, it was the brain that made them do it. Well, there's a researcher who for years has been interested in understanding what is this seductive allure of neuroscience? What is it that makes it so enticing for people that they are willing to listen to explanations rooted in the brain, even if that doesn't add very much information, and to rely more heavily on those arguments if it's rooted in the brain than rooted in some other space? So this researcher, Dina Weisberg, who's a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, she wanted to find out. And so she ran a series of experiments where she tested the hypothesis that simply putting up brain scans together with arguments made people more likely to believe that the arguments are true. So what she would do is she would include an example of some psychological phenomenon, like babies have the ability to do simple math. There are gender differences in spatial reasoning. There are differences in seeing and imagining objects. Okay? And she would put up those arguments for people and ask them how convincing they were for each argument. And she'd put them up with a series of utterly irrelevant charts and graphs, a series of utterly irrelevant brain images, and no information. Okay? Just the text itself. And sure enough, the text itself was not as compelling as the charts and images, which added a little bit of confidence that people had. Utterly irrelevant charts and information, right? Did not support the facts whatsoever. But the brain images, oh boy, you put up really pretty brain images that are lit up, and people believe it to be true. Okay. Now that is particularly true if you're talking about things like I was just talking about, like babies have the ability to do simple math. Oh, there must be some scientific reductionist explanation of that. So I put up a picture of brain scans which show babies' brains, again, having absolutely nothing to do with that argument. But the reductionists, our brain heuristics, our shortcuts, say, aha, their is evidence for the claim, and we believe it to be true. So she did this over and over again, and other researchers have replicated these findings time and again, and they have found similar effects on our inability to tell good arguments from bad arguments when you attach some reductionist scientific basis to it. Okay? If you can reduce a psychological phenomena to the brain, even if it's irrelevant, it's compelling to people. And in trying to understand that, like, why exactly is this? Why do our brains take this shortcut where we overweight arguments through the seductive allure of neuroscience? Reductive explanations may misguide us into failing to think. That seems to be one of the primary reasons that this is happening. Our brain uses the shortcut of the scientific explanation to not have to think critically about the issue ourselves. And that turns out to be incredibly dangerous. Because when you don't think and you take something as true because there is some pretty picture of a brain that is attached to it, or some other seeming information that is attached to it, you have lost the ability to be able to differentiate between information and disinformation. How many of you have tried ChatGPT? Surprisingly few of you. Next year, if I ask that question, assuming Charlie ever invites me back, I bet all of you will have tried it. And one thing that you will learn if you do is that it hallucinates. Okay? And by hallucination, what I mean is it makes up stuff. Okay? And it makes up facts. You can say, provide citations for everything you just said, and it will give you citations. It will take you a moment to realize those citations are utterly irrelevant in the same way that the brain images were utterly irrelevant. Then if you actually go and hunt down those citations, you'll realize that it's mixing authors and articles and just making up stuff. Then you'll say, that first article that you just gave to me doesn't actually make the point that you said it made. And ChatGPT will respond, you're right. I'm sorry for the confusion. Here's a different article instead that supports the proposition. And then you chase it down, it does not. That also doesn't support the proposition. You're right. I'm sorry. I do not have any articles that support the proposition. But if you just took the citations as true, if you didn't hunt down each and every article, would you believe it to be true? Would misinformation become a powerful way to shape and reshape your belief about something? One of the arguments I got back when I was researching something on ChatGPT was so exciting to me because I was like, oh my gosh, how did I not know this example? Why is it not in my book? And I chased it down and it was utterly made up, but it took me a while to figure that out because it was about a company that's international and I thought maybe it had translated documents that I didn't have access to. I had to literally go to the company itself, get in touch with them and say, is this true? And they're like, no, where did you hear that? I was fortunate to be able to chase it down to find that information, but how many people are going to do that? And how are these tools going to be used and these shortcuts in our brain? Why do our brains believe this information? Why do we do so? Reductive science is just a cognitive shortcut. We have lots of cognitive shortcuts, but this one, rooting information, is a cognitive shortcut. Another one is splashy headlines. How many of you have ever clicked on clickbait? All of you have clicked on clickbait, okay? It's designed to appeal to our unconscious cognitive biases, okay? And part of it is your brain is more attentive to information that is scary or frightening or alarming or disjunctive, right? Things that are incongruent. You pay more attention to those things. And so clickbait, the ability to make things sensational, the ability to induce fear, all of this is stuff that people are well aware of as they are developing strategies of cognitive warfare. Knowing how your brain works and the shortcuts that your brain takes as it looks at information makes information warfare so much more effective because you design information in ways that your brain doesn't stop to think. So, hold on. The result is that already our minds are being manipulated. Okay? Our minds are being manipulated, and that manipulation is getting ever more powerful. If you look at the disinformation dozen at the height of the COVID pandemic, individuals who intentionally spread misinformation about COVID, what you find is they used almost all of the strategies for cognitive heuristics to make people share and reshare information without stopping to think about it. It's intentional, it's not unintentional. Marketers use it intentionally. Political operatives use it intentionally. They understand cognitive heuristics, they understand the shortcuts your brain is taking, and they decide they're going to prime your brain with information. Okay? Duke professor Tanya Chartrand at the business school has studied this concept of priming for quite a while, and she provides a different way to understand the problem by pointing out to us that many people are worried about unconscious priming. Most of this is right out in the open. It's not hidden influences on the brain. It is simply tapping into mental processes that you are unaware of, and the consequences of those triggers are to prime your brain to act in particular ways. Share information, click on and open and read something, stay on a technology. Poets, politicians, governments all know how to exploit the unconscious influences on our lives and to exploit and manipulate hidden mechanisms to drive our behavior. Now, what does that look like when that is an intentional act of cognitive warfare? It looks like shaping preferences, and it looks like trying to read your mind and gather millions and billions of data points on individuals. The New York Times recently did this article in December 2021 on how the TikTok algorithm works. You've undoubtedly heard of the moves to try to ban TikTok, right? And that's for quite a few reasons, but one of them is how precisely it can read the minds of individuals who are using it. How does that happen? Microsecond changes of how long you spend on a particular video. The algorithm is so effective that after just a couple of hours of a person being on the platform, the information about the preferences and micro preferences and ways to influence the person become startlingly precise. And this is on billions, right, of phones now, collecting information, using that data. How will that data be used? How do you send out precise information to decide what goes viral, what ends up in a person's feed, what kind of information they are consuming on a daily basis, and how does that shape their preferences and views? How does that activate them in ways that could be incredibly dangerous? This is blurry, I apologize. I couldn't find a clearer image of it, but if you've ever used Twitter and you've tried to reshare an article, it says, do you want to read the article first? You seen that pop up? Do you know why it does that? Because it makes you slow down. Okay? The faster you go, the more your shortcuts just lead to spreading of misinformation or disinformation, the less you think. Slowing down, even for a second, just asking you this question engages a different part of your brain to make you slow down and think about the information. What if platforms had to do that? What if platforms had to integrate a way to make you slow down and think before sharing misinformation or disinformation or any information? What if our technology was better designed for humans and to safeguard us against misinformation or to safeguard us against cognitive warfare by requiring us to slow down and think, putting in mechanisms for thinking at every juncture? What if that became part of our national security defense on TikTok, where there is a message that pops up and says, you have been on the platform for 15 minutes. Do you want to continue doing so? Or something that popped up to say, these are all of the preferences that have been gleaned about you in the past half hour. Are you comfortable with continuing to share that with the Chinese government, right? Would that lead to differences in people's behavior? I would hope so, right? This is what we've learned about you in the past 15 minutes. That would be chilling. But it might be an effective strategy. The idea of banning TikTok is not going to work that well, I don't think. But something like that, transparency back to the user, here's what you've been targeted with over the past half hour. Here's the micro preferences that have been gleaned about you. And all of this, by the way, has just been shared with China. Do you feel good about that? Check here, right? I mean, these are things that would slow people down. Okay. You've maybe heard a lot of that, so you're not that scared. So now it's my turn to scare you a little bit, right? That's part of why Charlie invites me, is to try to scare you a little bit. Okay, remember I promised I would show you pictures of brains so that you would then walk away from my talk and be like, well, aha, brilliant, right? Actually, that's my brain, seriously. And that is my brain while I was wearing a consumer headset like the one on the right. And what it was doing was picking up the electrical activity in my brain as I was just relaxing at my computer screen, trying to record my brain so I could share it with you. Okay? Now, why is it able to do that? Because the average person who thinks thousands of thoughts each day, none of you are average, of course, you probably think millions, but the average person who thinks thousands of thoughts each day, as a thought takes form, right, neurons are firing in your brain. And as neurons fire in your brain, they give off tiny electrical discharges. And as it happens in characteristic patterns, like I am thinking about, what I'm about to say next, that is a characteristic pattern of firing that could be detected with electroencephalography or other neural wearable devices, and then decoded because algorithms have become so incredibly powerful. And what's happening in your brain is also data on which algorithms can be trained, and they're happening in patterns that can be trained on as well. That's been decoded over time so that we can start to know what a lot of that information means. Like a little while ago, a decade ago, ask a neuroscientist, and most of them would say, okay, but there's very little you can actually glean from that information. Today, you can already tell things just from surface-based electrodes, nothing fancy that is, a cap with a bunch of gel on it, just an ordinary surface electrode like you just saw. You can pick up people's emotional states. Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they frustrated? Are they angry? Are they engaged and listening? There's an old school headset. Haven't been able to get the IRB at Duke to approve me doing this, but I'm kidding, I haven't asked. So there's a little headbands where there are ears, and the ears are supposed to alert to your attention level in your brain. And if you are not paying attention, the ears start to droop. And if you're paying attention, they go up and alert. So I for next year, I will just hand those out at the beginning of the talk, and then, if somebody their ears are starting to droop, I'll be like, overflow room, right? But seriously, you can pick that kind of information up, brain states, okay? More startling, though, is you can actually start to reconstruct visual images in a person's mind. So if they're seeing the image on the left, the image on the right is reconstructed from electrical activity in the brain, okay, EEG activity. That's more startling for most people, is that it's not just basic states, it's also what's happening in the visual cortex, which you're visualizing in the brain. Shapes, too. Shape that a person is presented with is on the left. EEG signal is interpreted through machine learning algorithms. That's what's decoded on the right from brain signals. Okay? Which is to say, we are getting closer to the point where a lot more of brain activity can be decoded. How a person is feeling, simple shapes, letters, numbers that are in a person's brain. We can't literally, with modern science, decode complex thought. With implanted electrodes, that's increasingly possible for intentionally communicated speech, right? A person who has speech prosthesis because they're suffering from the inability to communicate otherwise. Speech prosthesis with implanted electrodes is enabling people to intentionally communicate speech from their brains. That's still different than the inner monologue that you're having, right? It's intentionally communicated speech. But every day, neurotechnology and neuroscience is getting better and better at decoding the patterns of activity in the human brain. And it's coming to average, ordinary consumers. This device is a device from a company called Control Labs. I saw a presentation by Control Labs in 2018 where what they did was they demonstrated the early prototype of the device. One of the co-founders was there and he said, look, isn't it unfortunate that we are so limited as humans by these clumsy things at the end of our arms? Wouldn't it be better if instead of having to use our hands, we had things like octopus-like tentacles? Think about how much more we could do. Or why are we typing with 2 thumbs? Why have we gone backwards in time in our ability to communicate? What if we could type at the speed of thought? Or at least type, instead of on a QWERTY keyboard, just think about typing. Do it on a virtual keyboard, and then just stop moving your fingers and think about communicating the words and have that decoded. And this does that. This picks up that activity as your brain activity travels down your arm. You have your peripheral nervous system, your motor neurons come down to your arm. Your intention to move right here and your intention to type is data that is training devices like this one to decode it so that the patterns of motor neuron firing that occurs here can be decoded into what you would do while typing. You would think about typing, those neurons still travel here, and you can still decode that. When I heard this presentation, I was blown away. Not just because it's neat technology, but I was blown away because I'd been following consumer neurotechnology for a very long time, and most of it looked like stupid little bands across your forehead, which nobody was going to wear all day, every day. And this was the first time I had heard of a company moving brain sensors into multifunctional devices like a watch. And I was convinced that they were the pivotal acquisition in neurotechnology to make this go mainstream, and that Apple was going to acquire them. I was very surprised a year later when Facebook did instead. For an undisclosed amount, but at least we understand it to be $500 million. Since then, they have been investing substantially in making this the interface for all of the rest of our technology. Just this past May, Mark Zuckerberg demonstrated an early prototype of the device. Their intention is to integrate it with their virtual reality headset as the way in which people move within VR. But he's made quite clear that their intention is to make it the universal interface for all of the rest of our technology. Let's take a quick look at where they are with it. Oops, let's see how we get the sound. Sound. Let's see if I can make it loud from my computer. All right. Use my voice? Is that what you said? Hang on, I'm gonna go up here. And I'm gonna use my mic. We'll just like put my mic on my computer. How's that? It's not gonna be the greatest sound, but it's gonna be better than nothing.
The wrist is a great starting point for us technologically because it opens up new and dynamic forms of control. This is where some of our core technologies like EMG come into play.
Neural interfaces, when they work right, and we still have a lot of work to go here, feel like magic.
So if you send a control to your muscle saying, I want to move my finger, it starts in your brain, it goes down your spine through motor neurons, and this is an electrical signal. So you should be able to grab that electrical signal on the muscle and say, oh, okay, the user wants to move their finger.
What is it like to feel like pushing a button without actually pushing it? That could be as simple as, hey, I just want to move this cursor up or move it left. Well, normally I would do that by actually moving. But here, you're able to move that cursor left. And it's because you and a machine agreed which neurons mean left and which neurons mean right. You're in this constant conversation with the machine.
this new form of control, it requires us to build an interface that adapts to you and your environment.
Pretty amazing, right? And it's getting better every day, and that's not the only multifunctional device on the market. This one, Emotive MN8, is launching in April. These I have a set of at home. You can take your conference calls, listen to your music, do everything that you would do with ordinary earbuds, except it also tracks your brain activity in real time. Okay, there are headphones by a company called Neurotechnology that have around the soft cups of the headphones brain sensors integrated into the ear cups, and they are launching in May with one of the biggest headphone manufacturers in the world to bring you brain sensing multifunctional headphones. Now, all of you are looking at me like, why would I buy these devices? Right? That's a good question, right? I'm not sure you should, but for the plan for most of these companies, the hope is to first put brain activity and brain health sensors on par with heart rate sensors, Fitbit sensors, the walking, the quantification of the brain, putting it on par with the quantification of all of the other information that humans have already quantified. And in some ways, that may be good. Taking brain health as seriously as we take other kinds of physical health, unlocking that potential could be transformative in the hands of individuals to use for themselves. But surely you recognize what it means to unlock the human brain and to make accessible that data to other people, while the hope of most of these companies is to replace your mouse and your keyboard to become the primary way in which you interact with all of the rest of your technology, and I believe it is coming. If you look at the major investments, this is part of one of the major themes of my book. I go through and document the millions of these headsets that have already been in use worldwide and the major investments by every major technology company in the world into this technology to become the way in which we interface with the rest of our technology. It will be more seamless for many people to interact with technology using neural interface technology. But we should be worried about what's going to happen with all of that data. And we should be worried about who else has access to this. This headset, the Flow Time headset, I learned about when I interviewed somebody for my book. So this person was running a meditation practice, had a huge following across the United States. They had tried different brain sensing headbands for their meditation practice, and they had discovered that this one was one of the preferred ones, and it was preferred because they got better access to richer data about what was happening in the brain, had more sensors embedded in it. So I got curious, right? Who makes it? Where is it developed? Where do you think it's made? China, yeah. It is made in China, and it's made by a company, Entertech, and we should be particularly worried. So this popular brain wearable is made and manufactured by Hangzhou Enter Electronic Technology, Entertech. And it's a Chinese-based company. They've accumulated millions of brain activity recordings from people worldwide, engaged in everything from mind-controlled video games to working, to sleeping, to interacting with their computer, and they collect a lot more than just brain activity data, right? They are also collecting everything from personal information, GPS signals, device sensors, computers, the apps a person is using, what's on their computer screen at the time. All of that's plainly disclosed in their privacy policy. And they're collecting IP addresses, operating systems, referring web pages, other pages visited, which means the US government probably shouldn't just investigate whether or not TikTok is problematic, but also whether or not people are using Flow Time while watching TikTok and other services, and what information about the human brain is being collected and how that information can be operationalized and used. Okay, this, if we're talking about the sixth domain, the human domain, freely giving away how people react to every piece of information that is in front of them is a little terrifying. And we should be worried and paying attention to this. And when I asked that person, did you know that flow time was developed and sold by this Chinese company? Do you know that their privacy policy accumulates all of your brain data? The answer was like, no, I'd never really thought about it, right? And that will be the general answer. I've never really thought about it. There's more terrifying things still that you can do. Researchers have looked at, for example, what happens when you're wearing a brain sensing headband and you're interacting on your computer and you enter your PIN number into your bank account. Guess what? It can be decoded. Okay, worse still, if you're wearing a brain sensing headband and you're not entering in your PIN number, but instead you're subliminally primed on your computer screen to see whether or not somebody can figure out their PIN number, the answer is yes, you can. You can probe brains through stimuli and figure out what their recognition of information is just with simple consumer-based headsets. Okay? These devices can be hacked. The environment in which a person is operating in can be hacked, and information that is concealed in the human brain can be accessed, at least simple information today. This is a real and present threat, as there is this growing trend toward consumer brain wearables that is going to go widespread. And there is very little cybersecurity, there's very little control over who has access to the data, and there's very little thought about who can sell those devices in the country and how they can be used. Which brings me to the last dystopian topic, which is assaulting the brain. Okay, cognitive warfare isn't just about shaping people's perceptions and stealing information. It's also about the development of weapons that can enable the potential to disrupt, disorient, and disable people on battlefields, in riots, and in ordinary life. Now, the extent to which any of this is developed yet, I do not know. What I do know is just the reports and attempts of it over time. Okay? You are undoubtedly familiar with the past program of MK Ultra in the United States and the attempts of trying to understand how LSD affects people, and the research studies that were undertaken to try to understand both LSD and other protocols that could potentially lead to mind control, in part developed by the US in defensive measure in response to concerns that our military personnel had been brainwashed abroad and trying to understand what the tactics were that were being used. The past is already the present in China. In late 2021, the US government blacklisted 12 Chinese institutes and firms that it believed to be working on dangerous biotechnology processes to support Chinese military end uses, including purported brain control weaponry. This followed reports that the Chinese People's Liberation Army is investing heavily in warfare techniques for cognitive domain operations, including $85 million allocated to the PRC's Ministry of Science and Technology in 2020 to fund AI research, including brain-inspired software and hardware, human-machine teaming, swarming, and decision-making. A recent Pentagon report describes the growing focus by the Chinese on intelligent warfare, including intelligent swarms, for example, that are operated not just by AI, but through brain-computer interface technology by humans in response to a single command, AI-based space confrontations, and cognitive control operations. And if you look at some of the translated military reports obtained by the Washington Times, there's this continuous thread that you start to see that war has started to shift from the pursuit of destroying bodies to paralyzing and controlling the opponent's mind. Okay, what exactly does that mean? What is that going to look into? The idea in some of these is that the brain is the headquarters of the human body, and precisely targeting those headquarters is essential in the future. Mind control gives fertile ground to science fiction and has forever. Some of my favorite science fiction films are about mind control. There are millions of people worldwide who believe that they are targeted individuals subject to mind control by governments, even their neighbors. Okay? I get calls from people like this all the time. That's not what I'm talking about. Okay? I'm not talking about technology that one's neighbor and one's friend has, but I am talking about an intentional development and pursuit of trying to develop electromagnetic weapons or microwave technology that could disrupt the human brain. The investigation into Havana syndrome, I think, is telling about whether and the extent to which such technology may exist. Recent claims make it plausible that the thing we fear is already here. Scores of diplomats have argued and have reported, whether they're stationed in Cuba and China starting in 2016, that they were experiencing strange mental ailments, including headaches and vertigo. When the National Academies of Science looked into this, they believed, even though they were not privy to classified documents, they came to the conclusion that they believed that there was some kind of electromagnetic weapon that was being used in targeting military personnel. The more this was researched, the more controversial it remains. Scientists and commentators have tried to find what the plausible explanations are. The US Department of State, when they turned to the National Academies, had one piece of information. Later, there were additional reports and congressional investigations that supported the same. Some scientists think, no, that's not what's happening here. It's just mass psychogenic illness, right? You have a few people who are distinguished to cite to a particular problem, and that starts to actually enable other people to assimilate those same types of symptoms into what is a mass psychogenic illness, rather than it actually being something that is really a directed energy weapon. And these scientists say, look, such technology simply doesn't exist, and we would have picked it up. We would see the size of it that would be required. We would see on satellite and other images. There was a recently declassified summary of the findings from an expert panel by the Biden administration. They agreed with the National Academy's findings. Many of the sections of the report were redacted. I can't put them up here because all of the parts I would find most interesting just have big black marks through them, including how the weapons might work. But the CIA came out in January 2022 saying, don't think so. Don't think a foreign adversary was behind this, except for maybe a couple dozen cases, which we're continuing to investigate, which we cannot explain in any other way. Okay. Where that leaves us is with this question of, we don't know. Okay? We don't know the extent to which these weapons are fully deployed and in development yet. We don't know if Russia has them. We don't know if China has them. We don't know. You might know. I don't know if the US has them. What's clear is it is the focus of the next domain of warfare. Whether that's through informational campaigns, stealing information from the brain, or weaponizing and disabling the brain, it is the domain of modern warfare. And that is something we should be investing a lot of resources and a lot of time into figuring out how to safeguard against. I'll leave it there. There's more on this in my book, The Battle for Your Brain, Defending the Right to Think Freely in the Age of Neurotechnology. I didn't go into all the things we can do to try to safeguard against this. This is more of a call to action, which is recognize what's happening in this space. I left a couple of minutes for questions. Is that all right?
Excellent.
Am I right, or did I go over? Did I leave a couple minutes for questions?
You have 10 minutes.
Okay.
So,
I intentionally did that.
questions?
Yes.
Sir? Right.
Can you put it up here?
Speak
It's
up
not,
a little bit.
Very nascent.
I think
Test. Yeah, that's better. Hey, I am Butch Bracknell. I worked on the NATO cognitive warfare concept for about a year before I left NATO. It's very nascent. It has no national guidance. This is a concept that's in front of the nations, and the nations haven't expressed any kind of direction about where to go with this. Can you speak to the issue of the things that our adversaries will do in the cognitive warfare versus the constraints that nations are going to? One of the big issues that we spotted was, hey, the 30 are not going to go. There's things that there's lines that they just won't cross that our adversaries will willingly cross because they don't even see lines. They don't see the Western norms in the same way.
Yeah, so one of the big themes that I write about in my book is the concept of freedom of thought, right? Freedom of speech and freedom of expression, if you don't recognize it, if you're not a country that recognizes freedom of thought, freedom of speech and freedom of expression, you probably also do not care that much about freedom of thought. And I say that because if you think about the lines and the norms that might prevent some action by some countries, it's about respect for human dignity, respect for the human mind, respect for agency of individuals and the capacity for decision-making, the capacity for being human. And attacks on the human brain attack literally the core of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be able to think freely, what it means to be able to think at all. And that's a line, I believe, that as an international human rights principle, many countries should adhere to and not cross. But if you look at some of the forms of psychological torture that have been undertaken, where the idea is that if it doesn't cause pain, it isn't psychological torture, many of these different techniques don't involve physical pain. Now, targeting to the brain to disable it and causing headaches does. Intercepting with manipulating or changing minds maybe doesn't. I think our concepts of psychological torture at an international level and psychological harm and interference with freedom of thought are going to need to be updated to figure out where we think the lines should and shouldn't be when it comes to this new domain of warfare. And I think we should be prepared that our norms and lines here will be different than in other countries, and adversaries will have different approaches to this, and we have to be prepared for that. We have to be prepared for the targeting of the human brain that is already happening and the increased ways and more precise ways that that's going to happen over time.
Nita, can I jump in with a question? Do you foresee a time, not today, but where you could have a non-cooperative subject, where you could do an interrogation where they don't say anything, yet you can get information?
So that's already happening.
Thank you.
So I mean, already there's something called the P300 and the N400 waves in the brain. These are preconscious signals in the brain. P300 tests recognition memory in the brain. N400 tests congruence of information. So, body in lake, body in woods. That's incongruent for one, congruent for the other. You can ask a person a series of questions while they have brain scanning technology that's on them, like EEG, and test for that P300 and N400. To the extent that they're conscious of you doing so, there are ways to fight that, right? I can just intentionally think of a pink elephant the entire time, and you're going to have a hard time getting very good and accurate P300 and N400 signals, but these are pre-conscious signals. You flash an image up in a moment, and the instantaneous recognition in my brain before I'm conscious of it is what you can do. There are police worldwide, investigators worldwide who are using P300 technology. We're investing here in the US, and other countries are investing in N400 technology to try to develop that same kind of capability. Yes?
Yeah, just to respond a little bit further to this issue of interfering with
Jeff,
freedom of
why don't you
thought.
introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Jeff Korn. I'm a professor at Texas Tech University School of Law. Just to follow up on this issue of developing capabilities that interfere with freedom of thought as a means of warfare, and listening to the reaction that if you're from a society that values freedom of expression, freedom of speech, so forth, that there's something troubling about it. It makes me think of the whole debate over blinding lasers as a means of warfare, right? In the abstract, it sounds really bad, but when you consider what the permissible alternatives are, then I think it creates a stress because, candidly, if I can disable an enemy commander by manipulating brain activity versus a kinetic attack that's going to result in death or permanent physical disability, then it seems to me a logical and potentially more humane method of achieving my ultimate military objective. And yet there's also this kind of consternation that it's something, a line we don't want to cross. I think most of us who've taught law of armed conflict, when we get to the issue of blinding lasers and you get to the point, well, you can shoot the enemy in the eye and that's legal, but you're not allowed to use a laser that results in permanent blindness. And then you start to question what's the ultimate rationale of that. So I think I'd be curious of your thoughts on, from a developmental standpoint, how do you draw a line when the ultimate outcome of the technology and the capability you're developing may actually produce a more humane outcome in achieving your ultimate military objective?
A lot of people, when I have introduced some of the coming developments in neurotechnology, say, well, okay, well, you're opposed to it, right? You ought to ban neurotech. Well, first, it's not like I have the power to ban neurotechnology, but the answer is no, right? And it's context specific, and it's comparing things against the status quo and looking, if you are, I'll give you a non-military example. One use of this technology already is to monitor for fatigue levels. If you're a commercial driver and you're monitoring for fatigue levels, and all you're getting is a level of 1 to 5, that's the only information you're getting from the person's brain, is that more or less intrusive into their privacy than having an in-camera cab that's trained on their face and picks up everything that's happening in the cab 24/7 while they're in it? I think it's less intrusive, right? And it may give you more accurate and precise information about what you care about, which is, are they sleepy or are they awake at the wheel? These have to be context-specific choices that we make to decide against what. Is it permissible? In what context and in what ways? When you describe it, I think, okay, maybe in that setting, but what about when there is a peaceful demonstration against a tyrannical government and all of the people who are demonstrating's brains are disabled to take them out against the ability to demonstrate peacefully? Of course, it will be used that way too. And I think that's a deeply immoral and problematic use, and the ability to literally change minds to prevent rising up peacefully and demonstrating against tyranny is something we should be quite worried about. So how do you use it in ways that are respectful of individual human dignity and agency, but also recognize sometimes it may be more humane than what we're doing already? I don't have the perfect answers for that, right? What I've tried to develop in my book is a framework for cognitive liberty, recognizing cognitive liberty is not an absolute liberty. No liberty is absolute. It has to be considered in the context of the broader situation that you're considering it in.
I think we might have time for one. General Kilpatrick.
I'm Dr. Kilpatrick and a former Air Force officer. Drawing on the title of the conference, Law, Ethics, and National Security, and particularly national ethics. Early in the talk, you commented on the fact that lawyers use the brain as an independent influence on the self, as if the brain is somehow independent of us. And also drawing on your PhD in philosophy, how does what you've described today relate to the self in the area of personal ethics and in the area of the spiritual?
So,
In 60 seconds.
What I've described are the material instantiations of the brain. That does not exclude a spiritual world. The fact that you can track brain activity and decode brain activity doesn't foreclose or say anything about whether or not there is a soul or a spirit or a metaphysical self, which cannot be tracked and quantified, even if there is material instantiations of consciousness in physical material. What happens when you die? Is there a soul that leaves the body? neuroscience doesn't answer that for us. Okay? Brain decoding doesn't answer that for us. What brain decoding does answer for us is that whatever metaphysical experience may exist, there is a physical representation of the mind, and that physical representation of the mind in the brain can be decoded. And as for the rest of it, the kind of bigger, like what does it tell us about self? I think it tells us that more and more ability to peer into oneself and know oneself is becoming possible. To test one's own assumptions about self, about preferences and desires and biases. The more you can have that reflected back at you in concrete and objective terms rather than just through self-reflection, the more iterative the process of development of self will become. Hopefully that was 60 seconds.
Thank you very much. Here's the book. You got to get it. It's very readable, and this is the cutting edge. Okay, we're going to take a break. I think Professor Farahany might be able to stay around for a few more minutes. We're going to come back at 19 after. 19 after. 19.01.